The sun was already low over the dry fields when Thomas Weller finished stacking the last bales of hay. The golden light caught the dust that hung in the air and painted everything with a soft glow. His farmhouse stood alone on the edge of the valley, quiet except for the sound of crickets and the slow creak of the barn door in the wind. Thomas was 51, a farmer all his life, his hands worn and rough from work and his back slightly bent from years of lifting and plowing. He had lost his wife 5 years ago to sickness, and since then the house had been empty. He never said much about it, but the silence had become something that followed him everywhere. He wasn't the kind of man to talk about loneliness, but it showed in the way he sat at dinner with just one plate, or how he stopped talking to his horse out loud because there was no one to answer. His days were spent fixing fences, feeding animals, and staring at the same sunset that used to mean the end of a shared day. Now it was just another reminder that he was alone. That evening, as he walked back to the farmhouse with his lantern swinging, he thought he heard something faint behind the line of mesquite trees. It wasn't the cry of an animal. It was softer, almost like a human voice, but broken and weak. He stopped, holding his breath, and listened again. The sound came once more, a small, tired call. Without thinking, he grabbed his lantern and moved toward the sound. The dry branches cracked under his boots. Behind a fallen log, half covered in dust and torn cloth, he found her, a young woman no older than her mid-20s lying on the ground. Her hair was long and black, her face marked by exhaustion and sunburn. She looked like she had walked for days. When she opened her eyes, they were dark and filled with fear. Thomas knelt beside her. "You're hurt," he said softly. She didn't answer, only blinked slowly. He saw her trembling hands clutching a piece of fabric with a pattern he recognized. Apache design, the kind that old traders sometimes brought through the valley. He knew then that she was from one of the Apache families that lived deep beyond the ridge. He spoke again, this time slower, calmer. "It's all right. I won't hurt you." Her lips moved, but her voice was just a whisper. "Water." He handed her his canteen and watched as she drank with shaking hands. Her skin was dusty and bruised, her feet swollen. Thomas looked around. There were no tracks, no horse, nothing. Whoever she was, she had been lost for days. He didn't hesitate long. He lifted her in his arms. She was light as a bundle of dry straw, and carried her back to his farmhouse. His dog barked once and then went quiet, sensing his tone. Inside, he laid her down on the old couch near the fire and covered her with his late wife's quilt. For a long moment, he just stood there, unsure what to do. When she woke later, she tried to sit up, but the pain in her leg stopped her. Thomas cooked her some soup and helped her eat. She was cautious, watching him closely, but hunger won over fear. He asked her name, but she only said one word: Naya. It was a soft name, like the sound of the wind over the canyon. Days passed, and Naya slowly regained her strength. She still spoke little, but Thomas noticed how she watched everything, how he fed the chickens, how he patched a hole in the barn roof, how he spoke gently to his animals. She seemed curious about the small details of his world. In return, she began to help in small ways, sweeping the porch, feeding the hens, carrying water. One morning, he found her sitting by the corral, sketching lines in the dust with a stick. She was drawing the shape of mountains. He sat beside her, careful not to scare her. "That where you come from?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Far side of the ridge. Storm took my people's horses. I walked. Long time." Thomas felt a heavy ache in his chest. She had probably been separated from her family and lost trying to find them. He offered to take her to the nearest town, maybe find help, but she shook her head quickly. Her eyes showed fear again. "No town, not like my people." He understood. The small towns around here were not kind to outsiders. He had seen enough of that to know her fear was real, so he let her stay. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the quiet farm began to feel different. There was laughter again, light and soft, when she learned to milk the cow and spilled half the bucket. There was music again when she hummed old Apache tunes while working in the yard. Thomas didn't know the words, but he liked the sound. It made the walls feel less empty. At night, when the wind blew cold, she sat near the fire, sewing her torn dress with thread he had given her. Sometimes she told small stories of her people, the land, and the spirits they believed lived in the rivers and stars. Thomas listened in silence, learning more from her quiet voice than he had from anyone in years. He found himself smiling more, though he didn't realize it at first. The farm that once echoed with emptiness now had footsteps, voices, and warmth again. He would catch her looking at him sometimes, not with fear anymore, but with calm trust. One evening, after fixing the fence together, they stood watching the sky turn orange and red. She pointed toward the setting sun and said, "My people say the sun goes to rest in the heart of the world. You work hard." "Like sun?" Thomas laughed quietly. "Guess that makes me old and tired too." She smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her smile so openly. As the weeks passed, Naya's leg healed completely. She could have left any time then, gone back across the ridge to find her people, but she didn't. When Thomas brought it up gently one morning, she only said, "No one wait there now." Her eyes lowered, and he didn't ask more. Instead, he told her she could stay as long as she wanted. She nodded, and something about that small moment settled deep inside both of them. One day he came in from the fields and found her in the kitchen, trying to bake bread the way she had seen him do. The smell of burnt flour filled the air, and she laughed shyly when he opened the door. "I try," she said, embarrassed. He laughed too, not because of the mess, but because it had been so long since laughter had come so easily to him. He helped her mix another batch, showing her how to knead the dough. Her hands brushed his once, and for a moment neither spoke. That evening they shared the first loaf she baked, slightly uneven but warm and soft. He thought it was the best bread he had ever eaten. Seasons changed. Winter came early that year, with frost on the windows and snow in the hills. The nights grew colder, and the old farmhouse creaked in the wind. Thomas made sure she had enough blankets, but one night, the wind howled so strong that she came out from her room, standing near the fireplace wrapped in her quilt. He poured her a cup of tea, and they sat together by the fire. The silence between them was different now, not empty, but peaceful. She spoke softly after a while. "In my tongue, when we live with someone, share food, share fire, we say he is my home." Thomas turned to look at her. Her dark eyes reflected the firelight, warm and calm. She added quietly, almost like a secret, "You are my home now." He didn't know what to say. Words felt too small for the feeling that filled his chest. All he managed was a slow nod, but his heart beat faster than it had in years. Outside, the wind kept blowing across the fields, but inside, the warmth stayed. He didn't realize it then, but from that night on, she began calling him something new, not Thomas, but a word in her language that meant husband, and he didn't correct her. Winter stayed longer that year, and the valley turned quiet under a soft layer of snow. Thomas woke early every morning to break the ice on the water troughs and feed the animals. Naya would already be up, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, warming milk on the stove. It had become their rhythm, two lives moving in quiet understanding. She learned to mend fences, to plant seeds, even to whistle for the horse the way he did. Every small thing she learned seemed to bring her joy, and Thomas found himself watching her with a kind of peaceful pride. Sometimes, when the evenings grew dark too early, they would sit together and share stories. She told him of her people, how they believed that each person carried the spirit of the land in their heart. Thomas would listen, amazed at how much she knew about plants, animals, and the signs of the sky. Once, when a storm was coming, she looked out at the horizon and said softly, "The clouds walk heavy tonight." Hours later, the rain came down, just as she said. He started to trust her instincts more than the weather radio. When spring returned, the land came alive again. Green grass pushed through the brown soil, and the air filled with the scent of wildflowers. Thomas took her to the nearby creek for the first time. The water sparkled under the sun, and she laughed as she stepped in, letting the cold water touch her feet. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, pure, light laughter. He realized then how much she had changed the place. The house was no longer silent, the yard no longer lifeless. The people from town began to notice too. Some of them came to trade goods or buy eggs, and they would look at her curiously. A few whispered when they thought Thomas couldn't hear, asking if she was one of those Apache girls from the hills. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't owe them explanations. He only said she was a friend who helped him with the farm, but to him, she was more than that. She had become the heart of his days. When he was out in the fields, he thought of her singing softly to the chickens or hanging the clothes to dry in the sunlight. Her presence filled every quiet space in his mind. One afternoon, when the air was warm and the wheat moved like gold in the breeze, Thomas found her near the corral, braiding her hair. She looked up and smiled. "The land wakes again," she said. "You have good soil, strong," he smiled back. "Couldn't have kept it that way without your help." She looked at him seriously then. "You give me home. I only give back." Those words stayed with him long after. That night, as he sat by the fire, he realized how much he didn't want to lose her. But he also knew how hard life could be for someone like her in this land, a world that didn't always understand kindness between people who came from different paths. Days turned to weeks, and the bond between them grew like the crops in his field. When he fell sick with a fever that summer, it was Naya who cared for him. She sat by his bed, wiping his forehead with cool water and whispering quiet prayers in her language. He drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes hearing her soft humming like a dream. When he finally woke strong enough to sit up, she smiled at him with relief and said, "You stay, you strong man. My spirits listen." He didn't know what her spirits were, but he was grateful all the same. Later that week, she told him she wanted to visit the ridge, the high ground where she could see her people's old trails. He took her there in the wagon. The climb was rough, but when they reached the top, she stood silently looking out over the endless land. The wind lifted her hair, and for a long time she didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was low and steady. "No one left there now. My people move away. I think the wind bring me here for reason." Thomas stood beside her, looking at the same view, the open valley that had been his whole life. "Maybe it did," he said quietly. She turned toward him then, and for the first time she took his hand in hers. It was a simple touch, but it said everything that words couldn't. When they returned home that evening, something had changed between them. Not spoken, not rushed, but deep and sure. She began wearing one of his shirts when she worked in the yard, and he didn't mind. He started saying we instead of I. It felt right. The townsfolk noticed again. One day, the store owner, an old man named Harris, said with a half smile, "Looks like you got yourself a good helper there, Tom." Thomas just nodded. "Best one I ever had." Life moved on quietly. Together, they planted a new orchard behind the barn. They laughed when the young trees grew crooked, and she tied ribbons on them so she could tell them apart. When the first apples came, she called them lucky fruit and gave one to every neighbor who would accept it. Some did, smiling kindly. Others still looked uneasy. But Thomas didn't care. He knew what mattered. One evening, after a long day of work, a wagon rolled up the dirt road. It was a man from the county office asking about land taxes. The man glanced at Naya as she stood in the doorway, then looked back at Thomas. "She your wife?" he asked flatly. For a moment, Thomas hesitated. Then he nodded once. "Yes," he said calmly. "She is." The man wrote it down without question. But Naya heard it. Later that night, when they sat by the fire, she looked at him and asked softly, "You call me wife?" He smiled a little. "That's what you call me, isn't it?" "Husband?" Her eyes softened. "Yes, because my heart say that word." He reached for her hand, rough with work but warm in his. "Then it's true enough." From that day on, there was no pretending. They lived as husband and wife in every sense of care and companionship. He built her a small garden by the window so she could grow herbs she liked. She carved small wooden figures that she placed on the shelf, symbols of peace and gratitude. Their world was small but full of meaning. As years passed, the land around them changed. New farmers came, new roads were built, but the old farmhouse stood as it always had. The people who once whispered behind their backs now greeted them kindly, some even asking Naya about her remedies when someone fell sick. She helped anyone who came to her door, and soon she was known for her gentle ways. One cold evening, a young couple from town came seeking shelter after their wagon broke down in the snow. Thomas and Naya welcomed them in, gave them food and blankets. The woman looked around the warm room, the firelight dancing on the walls, and said softly, "Your home feels alive." Naya smiled at that. "Because love live here," she said simply. When spring came again, Thomas planted one more field, though his hair had turned mostly gray by then. Naya worked beside him, her hands steady and sure. He often caught himself looking at her, realizing how much peace she had brought into his life. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he thought about the day he found her near the fallen log, tired, afraid, alone. and he wondered if fate had planned that meeting all along. One evening, they sat together outside watching the sunset spread across the valley. The air smelled of grass and earth, and the world seemed calm. Naya rested her head on his shoulder and said softly, "When I first come here, I think I am lost. But now I know. I was only walking home." Thomas turned to her and smiled. "Guess we both were." The last light of the day touched the fields in gold, the same way it had the day he first saw her. Only now the farmhouse behind them wasn't quiet or lonely anymore. It was a place of laughter, warmth, and shared life. A home built not by chance but by kindness. In the valley, stories began to spread about the farmer who once lived alone and the Apache woman who changed his life. People said their home never felt cold even in winter, because the warmth between them never faded. And in the evenings, when the wind blew softly through the grass, neighbors swore they could hear her singing, a tune that carried the sound of both her people and his land joined forever in peace.